Hey, it's Mazzy. I want to talk about the Beatles and photographers. The photographers that photographed the Beatles, arguably the most photographed celebrities in the history of the world. Now, of course, where we are now with everyone with an iPhone, everyone with a camera, there are people photographed literally every single minute. But in terms of the historic nature of photography and the historic nature of the Beatles, closing down and breaking up in 1970. I'm really talking about that period up until 1970, from 1962 maybe to 1970. And I'm doing that because I'm celebrating the release today. It's on June 13th, 2023, of this book of photographs by Paul McCartney called 1964 Eyes of the Storm. I'm doing this video because I was turned down by the publicist of Paul McCartney to do an interview with Paul McCartney. Now, before you get on your high horse and say, Mazzy, why would McCartney talk to you? Well, I put together a pitch because I think this would have been a really amazing conversation. Maybe he'll see this and it'll still happen. But to celebrate this book that just came out. These are photographs McCartney literally just uncovered in the last couple of years that were taken in 1964 when the Beatles came to America and around that time. And if you've seen pictures from Ringo's Star, all the Beatles were walking around New York City with cameras taking pictures, and McCartney discovered literally in the eyes of the storm this book. I'll show you at the end of this. I'll show you some pictures, so you have to wait till the end till I finish this conversation. But I've been a photography agent for, this is my 38th year in business. I represent a wonderful artistic selection of commercial photographs, do some editorial work, but mostly in ad campaigns. We've done some record covers over the years. And I've been working in the photo industry for 38 years. I dabbled into photography myself as a young man, but I never really wanted to be a photographer. And I'm in awe of these wonderful photographers that I work with and these photographers who photographed the Beatles. I'm going to talk about several of them. There's too many, way too many who photographed the Beatles to call out every single photographer who photographed the Beatles collectively or individually. But I thought a great discussion would be talk to Sir Paul McCartney about his experience and his recollections working with some of these amazing photographers. Take 5 photographers, take 10 photographers, depending on time. Photographers like Astrid Kircher, obviously in Hamburg, Dezo Hoffman, the early promo pictures in 1962 in Liverpool. Robert Freeman took, 5 Beatle covers? Robert Whittaker, the Butcher cover, the Trunk cover, Art in Japan, On the Road with the Beatles. Richard Avedon, those great psychedelic posters, that great photographs of 1967. George Harrell, that great Hollywood portrait photographer who worked later with Paul and Linda. Ethan Russell, of course, the Get Back sessions, the last photo session that became the cover of the Hey Jude, Beatles Again album, and of course, the Get Back session. So many others, countless others, but I'm going to talk about a few, but I do have a little bone to pick. I reached out to Paul McCartney's publicist in New York, hoping to have this discussion with Sir Paul and his recollection working with these great photographers, some of them. And I was told that he's not doing really much publicity for this book. Okay, he does have a show opening as we speak at the National Portrait Gallery in London, an amazing museum. I highly recommend, if you're in London, if you're going to be in London, go see this show. It's a wonderful museum. Just see the whole everything in their collection. I've been there several times and it is astounding. It is a wonderful place to see artwork, and they do have special shows, and to see Paul McCartney's work from this book I think would be just really a perfect time and another excuse to see all the wonderful artwork, paintings mostly, and photographs in their permanent collection. But I just saw, as this show opens, there is a publicity thing happening, and it's going to be a conversation with Sir Paul McCartney by none other than Stanley Tucci. I think they missed the boat here. Now, I've been told that I slightly resemble Stanley Tucci. My guess is obviously he's an actor, he's a celebrity. He's known a lot more than I'm known. But does he know about photography? Does he know about photographers? Does he know about the history of photography, of these great photographers? Sure, he can bone up, he can read a script. But that's my rant at the beginning of this video. But I want to just go through some books I have in my collection of some of the great photographers who collaborated with the Beatles, accidentally in some cases, some obviously assigned to work with them. Let me start out with this book. This was a Genesis Press book. This is Jurgen Vollmer, German photographer who did a lot of these early photographs of the Beatles in Hamburg. You've seen a lot of these at the Hamburg clubs they played in around the time. There's a very famous picture of John Lennon standing in a doorway that was used on his rock and roll solo album, co-produced with Phil Spector. And just a wonderful series of images of the time in Liverpool and in Hamburg, Germany. Of course, you may recognize this picture. It was used on a Smith's Comp album cover as well, Liverpool Days. This is From Hamburg to Hollywood. Jurgen Vollmer, a photographer who worked with them early at the clubs in Hamburg on the Reeperbahn. Another, obviously, in that same time period is Astrid Kircher. When We Was Fab is another great book put out by Genesis Publication out of the UK. And this collects a lot of her early work with the Beatles and portraiture, including this fabulous photograph of Stu Sutcliffe and a series of wonderful natural light portraits done in Hamburg, Germany. That's Astrid Kirchner, When We Was Fab, Genesis Publications. So Robert Freeman is a photographer and an art director, and obviously he's responsible for this great image taken in a hotel hallway with natural light draping in that was used in the UK with the Beatles, and of course in America on the cover of Meet the Beatles. Love this photograph he took of their boots, Beatle boots. His album covers include With the Beatles, Beatles for Sale, Hard Day's Night, Help, and of course, the wonderful portrait, Rubber Soul. It was Robert Freeman who also did the closing credits for A Hard Day's Night and Help. A great series of portraits here. Robert Freeman. I'd love to talk to Paul about his experience working with Robert Freeman and all these photographers. And of course, this image that Robert created for what was going to be the album Revolver. And of course, instead they used a Klaus Vormann illustration with some images from Robert Freeman as cutouts within it. Robert Freeman. Another great photographer of the 20th century was Norman Parkinson, and this is a series he started in 1963, photographing the Beatles in Liverpool, went to London, photographed them during recording in Abbey Road Studios. Just a lovely book of session work as well as sort of reportages that capture the moment in photography. Norman Parkinson. Then there's Terry O'Neill. Terry O'Neill worked with them over 50 years. This is a book that just recently came out, the definitive collection. There's been books over the years of most of these photographers, different volumes. Sometimes they were segmented, but this is a really wonderful overview that just came out. Like several photographers, here's a wonderful picture of the Beatles out in the yard at Abbey Road Studios. He wanted something a little different, getting out of the studio. So that takes him out. And of course, again, like several of these photographers, like Norman Parkinson, like Ethan Russell, there's pictures of the Beatles during their studio sessions as well. But this goes over literally 5 decades. Wonderful photographs. In later years, George Harrison at Friar Park, Paul and Linda on the road, and this famous picture. Wonderful, beautiful picture, a sad picture. I believe it was for Life magazine. This is Ringo's wedding to Barbara Bach, and this was not long after we lost John Lennon, George and Olivia, Paul and Linda, and of course, Ringo and Barbara. What a great, great portraiture. Great photographs of Terry O'Neill. This is one by Harry Benson, another photographer who joined the Beatles on tour, photographed them. Literally hundreds of pictures of the Beatles on the road by Harry Benson. Again, very reportage, coming to America, on tour, wonderful series of shots during the promo tour when they met Cassius Clay, obviously later Muhammad Ali. Wonderful, wonderful, fun session. And what's great about a lot of these books, you have sort of first-person accounts of the photographers talking about the image. The books especially that came out while they were living. Some of these photographers are alive, some obviously are not. But wonderful, wonderful book. Again, several volumes of books. This is On the Road, 1964, 1966. This is a Taschen publication. I couldn't talk about photographers who worked with the Beatles without talking about Robert Whittaker. The selfie of Robert Whittaker. This is a book, The Unseen Beatles, photographs of Bob Whittaker, the late Bob Whittaker. Great shot of, obviously, John, Cynthia, and a young Julian. But amongst all of Robert Whittaker's photographs, the one that he'll probably always be known most famously for is this. Known as the butcher cover, it was used on Yesterday and Today, the comp in America. It was pulled back, his trunk photograph pasted over. If you read his account of that, he was really into the Surrealist movement at the time and wanted to do something a little different with the Beatles. They were there for a session. I think it was for a picture sleeve cover for a single. And he was very influenced by the Surrealist artists, including Hans Bellmann, who was a German Surrealist painter, photographer, and sculptor, and did a lot of these large formatted mannequin, decapitated mannequins of women. And that was the basis for the idea for this. And again, if you read Robert Whittaker's creation, this wasn't originally intended as an album cover. In fact, he didn't know about it until after the fact, until it was out and withdrawn. He did a series which was going to be a triptych of various images from this series. So you can kind of look through these books and see several outtakes. Obviously, a lot of Surrealist attempt at Surrealism was shot on that same day. Robert Whittaker. One of the most famous American photographers in the fashion and portrait world was Richard Avedon. From the 1940s into the 50s, he did numerous photographs of fashion models for fashion sessions. The film Funny Face with Fred Astaire and Audrey Hepburn was loosely based on Richard Avedon again, and he was the photography consultant in that film and on set with Fred Astaire when they made that movie. But he worked in 1967 on one session, on one day with the Beatles. And again, I consider it one of the most famous sessions ever, and that would be this session. Of course, this graced the cover of Look magazine in 1967, as well as German Stern magazine. The images were solarized after the fact, a technique that he really didn't do. Most of his work at the time was black and white for years. Yes, he shot color, but this was a whole different series of him. This is a book of his work. It's not just a work, obviously, on the Beatles, but I wanted to showcase these because in 1967, I sent away for these posters, I believe, if I'm remembering this correctly, in the summer of 1967, just prior to my 13th birthday and my bar mitzvah, I sent away $7.50 for these wonderful posters. It included the 4 posters plus a fold-out black and white composited of just beautiful, beautiful portraits of the Beatles. And if you've watched my videos in the past, maybe I'll just kind of insert here. I still have those exact copies from 1967 framed. This is the 3rd time I framed them when I moved to Seattle from San Francisco 9 years ago. And I cherish those pictures, and I love those pictures. So Richard Avedon, a really important photographer in fashion and portraiture. Richard Avedon. Now I want to group a handful of photographers together, even though there was one lead-off photographer, a main photographer with several other associated photographers that came along to be like 2nd and 3rd shooters. And that has become known as a day in the life of the Beatles or a mad day out. The main photographer was Don McCullen. He was a World War II veteran photographer. Interesting how he was chosen. And he walked around London with the Beatles and an entourage, and they showed up at costume areas, at theatrical areas, on the street, just different parts of London. Can you imagine in 1968 seeing the Beatles walk around and being photographed by an entourage? Again, Don McCullen was the main photographer. There was also Tom Murray. This is the book of his work. A lot of these photographs you'll see of the exact same setup. So when the Beatles were looking through a grid, when they're walking on the side of the road, the side of the Thames. So different variations of those images by the various photographers. This is something I'm very proud of because I helped edit this book. This is by Stephen Goldblatt, who was a young lad at the time and along for the ride. He is now a director of photography. He's worked on major motion pictures in Hollywood. He lives in Berkeley, but he's a British photographer. This was a book of his work that we put out about 12, 13 years ago, a limited edition. So I introduced Stephen to a designer named Michael Rylander, who designed this book and did this wonderful clamshell case, a limited edition. And this has, again, images you know from this series. Sometimes you don't know which photographer shot them. This was my favorite image, and it included a print of this in the limited edition book. Mad Day Out. Mad Day Out. In 1968 and 69, a young photographer moved to England, and that was Ethan Russell. He worked on some of the shots at the White Album sessions. He is the one responsible for shooting the last official photo session with the Beatles that were on the cover of Hey Jude, the comp album. He also put together all these images, shot these images for Let It Be, Get Back. This is the original book. Many people have this book unbound since they are very fragile and they fall apart. But it's a wonderful series from the making of what became Get Back. And of course, we know it as Let It Be, originally in 1970. Ethan Russell also did the cover of the Who's Next album, Rolling Stones on tour as well. Another great photographer. So before I close out showing the new book of Paul McCartney and showing some spreads, some of the photographs he took in 1964, I want to show 3 books of 3 photographers are basically in the family. Now, I would like to talk to Sir Paul about this. I think that would be a fun conversation, interesting. You know, maybe picking 5 of those photographers, not every single one, and just, you know, going back and getting a sense of recollection, what it was like during those sessions. You know, those are pivotal times. Obviously, there's so much you can't remember every little detail, but let me start with this, another Genesis book, and this is photographs of Mike McCartney. Of course, he changed his name to Mike McGear professionally, but he took some amazing photographs because he was obviously in the family, at home, and was a photographer, also a songwriter, and a comedian. Beatles at the Cavern, mostly emphasizing on brother Paul. This is a wonderful photograph of Paul and his father in the garden. And I love this. Paul and John with Gene Vincent at the Cavern. And I've heard Paul talk about this image, one of the yin-yang shots of John and Paul learning a song, writing a song, lefty and righty. Great, great shots by Brother Mike, another Genesis publication. Now, like Paul in 1964, the Beatles were taking pictures. Ringo really stuck with it for many, many years, and Genesis did put out a series of books, including this one that Ringo put out. And this is Ringo Photographs. This, again, another limited edition by Genesis. Drummer, Joker, Ringo Starr. And finally, the lovely Linda Eastman, of course, Linda McCartney. Photographer before she met Paul, photographed a lot of musicians, a lot of rock stars, including Jimi Hendrix. There have been several publications on the work of Linda. Linda McCartney, Taschen Books. I'm going to close out, obviously, with a little deeper look, somewhat of a deeper look of 1964, Eyes of the Storm, the new book by Paul McCartney, showcasing photographs that he didn't remember. I don't think knew it even existed still after all these years, and they were uncovered. Liverpool, London, Paris, New York, Washington, Miami, segmented by cities, obviously shots of the Beatles unearthed, shots that obviously none of us have ever seen. Of Paul McCartney, and photographs taken by some of the world's greatest photographers over the many decades. So 35 millimeter photographs taken by Paul McCartney, just published 1964, Eyes of the Storm. So I just wanted to showcase a number of photographers who worked with the Beatles over the years, some just for a moment and some for decades and decades. Wonderful pictures, many of which you've seen before, some you haven't, but now you maybe have a little taste of their names, and you might pursue their work beyond the Beatles. Photography is a wonderful thing, and of course now it's changed with everyone having a camera, a disposable camera or a camera at hand. But these are photographers who primarily over the years shot with film, analog, and took these great, great pictures of this, arguably the most famous people of the 1960s in the world. So thanks again for watching. I'm here if you want to talk, Sir Paul. Let's talk photography. Thanks again for watching. Mazzy loves you.